tigers out in India, out in India. They bite, they scratch, they make an awful fuss. It's no use stroking them and saying, huss, huss, huss. Hunting tigers out in India, out in India.
Welcome to Itihasdhir, sir.
Namaste.
So we want to ask you about the background and personal journey you've had. So what drew you as a European scholar to Indian history, culture, and the study of Hindutva?
Well, I had a fairly India-friendly upbringing, though my parents were very staunch Catholics, and I had a Catholic upbringing. I was a choir boy, and I took it very seriously, because for many people it was just going, along with what was the established practice in those circles. I read as much about it as I could at that age, and I consider the future within Catholic practice, maybe even as a priest. And nevertheless, once in a while I experienced things that brought me closer to India. Like, as a child, I remember getting an illustrated translation of the Mahabharata, which I read with enthusiasm. My father practiced Hatha Yoga, and he read quite a bit about it, and so occasionally he spoke about what he had learned. So I learned along. I don't think my siblings followed it that much, but I did. And then as a student, I was very much interested in what shall I call it, the big questions. And so I studied Western philosophy and Chinese philosophy, but I became aware that what was really central was Indian philosophy. And so I studied that. I studied Sanskrit, I studied some Hindi, not so thoroughly, as well as Chinese and Persian. It was all part of my Orientalist curriculum. Though I did not have any plan to go to India. And part of the reason is that just the last year of my studies, I had a chronic disease, 1 year long, and I really didn't like, exposing myself to all the diseases that go around in India, or that's what I heard. And there was no need to go to India. So I thought, you see, people who study Socrates and other Greek philosophers, they don't mostly feel a need to actually go to Greece. And so, why go to India if you can study Yajna Valkya at home? Nevertheless, nowadays you see traveling is easy. So, okay, let's take a little jump to India. Though I was already 29 when I finally arrived in Delhi and Varanasi. And then it was love at first sight. And so that hasn't gone away anymore. Another important influence is Father Herman Rasgaard, a Jesuit, whose sister was the best friend of my mother. And so when he went as a missionary to India and was martyred there, I heard all about it many times. I read everything, every newspaper clipping and so on about it. And so the reason why he died there was that he tried to intervene in a communal riot. And so one of the hotheads, probably one of his own parishioners, took a stone and threw it at him. And, he died as a consequence. So that drew my attention to the so-called communal problem in India, the interreligious relations. And so very soon when I was in India, I wasn't looking for that. I was interested in philosophy. But then I thought, well, let's leave philosophy for when I'm old and hopefully wise. But let's now do something, that has to do with the events today. And so the communal events were very interesting, especially because very soon I noticed that everything I'd heard about it was pretty wrong. And even though it came from all the big professors and the big newspapers and so on, well, they didn't have it right. And so very soon I found that there was in fact something I could contribute. There was this historical controversy going on about the Ayodhya temple. So I studied that a bit and wrote a booklet about it, which was a bit of a sensation in India. Not because it was very original, it was just a journalistic account of what was happening. But the booklet did bring the message that, you see, there has been a consensus that there was a temple there. And right now, that is to say in 1990, there has been created an impression that there was no temple there and that there is a controversy. And what really is simply the scholarly consensus was suddenly turned into the Hindutva claim, and that there had been a temple there. And so I investigated that, and I concluded that of course there was a temple there. And so that later has also been verified. Yes, there was a temple there. And that book was nothing special. I mean, for Indians who followed this controversy, there wasn't much news in it, except for my name. You see, here was finally a Westerner who concluded in favor of the Hindu claim, or rather, in favor of the scholarly findings, which happened to support the Hindu claim. So most Western India watchers, both in academia and in journalism, had absorbed the so-called secularist claim that there had not been a temple there. And so it was a little bit of a sensation that here was a Westerner who favored the Hindu position. So that was partly thanks to Sitaram Goel, whom I had met in the meantime, the great Hindu historian. And so he had a more sophisticated view of the whole affair than what at that time you heard everywhere. The Hindutva movement, they had a fairly simplistic interpretation of what it was all about. I'll sum it up in just one example. They always said that this was a conflict between the Indian hero Rama and the foreign invader Babar. But in fact, the foreignness of Babar has nothing to do with it. You see, the Greeks were foreigners under Alexander, and so when they settled in northwestern India, they became Buddhists, like in Menander, the subject of the Milinda Panya, a Buddhist text. Or they became Krishna worshippers, like Heliodorus, who set up the Heliodorus pillar in Sanchi. Or you had the Huns who became Shaivas and so on and so on. They integrated, they assimilated. Whereas by contrast, Malik Kafur or Tipu Sultan were born in India, and yet they destroyed Hindu temples. So it is more correct to say that it is the Hindu hero Rama whose birthplace temple was destroyed by the Islamic invader Babar. So, I mean, those are the details I came to understand after talking a lot with Sitaram Goel. So, that's how I ended up in India. And that first book, you see, that book was not very important. Nevertheless, because of who had written it, it appeared on the front page of many newspapers. There was at that time a press conference presided over by Girilal Jain, the former editor of the Times of India, with L.K. Advani. And so my own publisher, namely this same Sitaram Goel, had asked Advani when showing my book to the assembled press to also show his own book, which was this list, some articles, about the affair, but especially conspicuous was this list of almost 2,000 Hindu temples that had been demolished or turned into mosques. So that was a little bit less to the liking of the BJP, because it made this Hindu-Muslim conflict rather than an Indian foreigner conflict. Anyway, so that way that book also got some publicity, and deservedly so. So you see, then the big advantage that this turn of events had for me was that suddenly all the doors of the Hindutva leaders went open, and normally they were at that time very shy of publicity, and especially of Westerners. And so, I mean, the RSS as a whole already had a very non-communicative attitude. They didn't like the press, they didn't like reading, they didn't like books. You see, they had this Boy Scout attitude of, do well and don't look back. And if they backbite against you, well, ignore it. Take it in stride, you see, constructive work, that is what should be done. And so they certainly didn't look for press attention, they avoided it, and certainly from Westerners. And so suddenly me, I was allowed in. I could even sit in on a few of their meetings. So very interesting. And so that gave me a lot of material that my colleagues didn't have. And so I could write a PhD thesis about this, which is what I did. And well, you see, that's how I sort of became a part of the landscape here.
So speaking of the landscape, you've also written the book, The Saffron Swastika.
Yes.
What were the challenges you faced while writing the book, especially given that it was a very sensitive subject matter?
Well, I didn't face any challenges while writing this book. I had, of course, noticed that there is an enormous amount of slander against the Hindu movement. And so this talk about Hindu fascism is a major example. So I decided to counter that. And so that's mainly what the book is about. So the writing that was nothing special. Only nobody had ever taken that subject, you see. I mean, so many people just take over that propaganda, reproduce it, but nobody had investigated it. Yeah, so that was new. Otherwise, you see, I've had practically no reaction to it, not from the Hindu side either.
And how do you view the relationship between Hindutva and the broader Indic civilization?
Well, it made sense at the time when it saw the light of day in the 1920s. At that time, nationalism was very much in focus for different reasons. So in Europe in the 18th, 19th century, and still in the 20th century, it was of course a very important force of state formation. Then in the colonies, this then had an effect that they also wanted to be nation states. So all while fighting for their own independence, they absorbed a lot of Western thought. And Western thought as it was at that time, because the West was not always nationalist. And what added to it is the effect of the First World War. For quite a few participating countries, that is really what made them countries. The most famous case is Australia. This was a very young conglomerate of all kinds of people, like British criminals who were condemned to banishment to Australia. And so participating in the war as auxiliary troops of the British to fight mainly against the Turks forged a national unity. And now this is also, for instance, the case in Belgium. You see, Belgium was created in 1830 quite artificially, and for a long time, you see, this was a state on paper. People didn't feel Belgian. And indeed, you see, in those days, they spoke about earlier occupation. We lived under the Spanish, we lived under the French. And the same way they said, we live under the Belgian. So they saw it as just the same as foreign rule. Whereas the experience of fighting together against a foreign enemy, that created a Belgian national feeling. So in India, you have to see all these things on the background. Oh, a similar thing also, the unification of Italy. This is a very specific influence. You see, the ideological statement by Giuseppe Mazzini was translated by Savarkar, no less, by the founder of Hindutva, or the man who thought of the notion of Hindutva. And so that became a lasting influence on the Hindu movement. So then Savarkar, who published this book in, I think, 1924, applied that to the Indian situation. And so he thought of the challenges before the Hindus in terms of nationalism, which was fairly new. You see, those on the left who say that Hindutva is largely a Western influence have a point, And I mean, those who say, no, you see, Hindu nationhood already existed since thousands of years. We say, for example, that the Vedic hymn, the Prithvi Sukta, the hymn to Mother Earth, that is a very early instance of Rashtra Bhakti, of devotion to the mother, of patriotism. That is an anachronism. And indeed, you see, if you read the hymn, you will see, if you want to use it for a modern political movement, it would be environmentalism. You see, it's a praise of the earth, and it describes the earth and all the different landscapes on earth and how it sustains us all, and so on. But so in any country you could write that. And of course, you see, everybody is attached to the country that happens to be his. There's nothing specifically Indian about it. So the idea of projecting nationalism back deep into your national history, that is misconceived. And indeed, you see, that's my final verdict really is nationalism is a misstatement of Hindu concerns. So at the time, during the freedom movement, Hindutva had a certain role to play, but in the larger context, I don't think it was a good idea.
So moving on, your works combine historical analysis with contemporary observations.
Yes.
So how do you strike a balance between these dimensions?
Well, if striking a balance means maintaining an equal distance from both, I wouldn't describe my own attitude in that way. You see, of course, you have to remain objective. It is important that your opinions on modern issues don't distort your historical work. But I think it's perfectly normal that a historian also has opinions about contemporary issues and that he will link the two. And so issues like, that's the first thing that they will think of, the Hindu-Muslim relations. Well, yes, you see, what happened in the past will have some influence on how we think about this. You see, all the people who say, no, you see, Hindu-Muslim unity and Sarva Dharma Samabhava, and all religions say the same thing and so on, they hurry to suppress any serious investigation into Hindu-Muslim conflict. And so since Nehru, the justification is that, this will create conflict, and therefore it's better to forget this, to wipe this under the carpet. And, I disagree with that. History is just what it is. And any history deserves to be looked into. So, and the modern consequences that they fear don't follow from this at all. You see, everybody knows the atrocities that Germany has committed in its National Socialist phase, and everybody is quite explicit about that nowadays, and it does not follow that we hate contemporary Germans, let alone that any conflict follows from this. So, you see, these things can perfectly be said.
So, among your upcoming books, can you also describe your process when you're writing it and how you choose the topic? Like, your upcoming book is about national symbols of India.
Yes.
So, can you talk a little bit about your process and how you came upon the topic?
How I came upon the topic? Well, you see, I didn't think of it, it just happened, namely, in August 2023, there was some debate in the press about a statement by Narendra Modi, or at any rate by the government. They hosted this G20, and so a number of dignitaries from other countries came visiting, and there was some event organized for them that would be presided over by Draupadi Murmu. And so the Hindi text said that Draupadi Murmu, the Rashtrapati of Bharat, was going to host this. And the English text then would normally have said, that Draupadi Murmu, the president of India, was going to be there. Instead it said the president of Bharat. And so there was then a lot of talk about, is this proper, should this happen, is this not squeamish, or is this not, self-centered to impose your own language on people speaking another language, and so on and so on. And then, of course, the question was also asked, and what does Bharat really mean? Now, for many people, for most BJP supporters, for instance, it was very simple. The term Bharat was an Indian term, and India, few people thought about its origins, but at least they knew that invaders like Alexander the Great, let's say Alexander of Macedon, okay, and the British used the term India. And so they thought India foreign, Bharat Indian. And so here you have another instance where that for the BJP is what counts. Not Hindu or any other religion or so, but us versus them. And so, of course, I didn't like that approach. And anyway, the meaning of the name Bharat was far more interesting. So many people haven't gone into the meaning of Bharat. They only know that on post stamps you have India, Bharat. And it didn't go deeper than that. Now, okay, what is Bharat? Bharat means of Bharata, belonging to Bharata, the descendants of Bharata, the territory of Bharata. Okay, so who is this Bharata? And there are many Bharatas, just like in the West there are many Alexanders. And all these Alexanders have ultimately been named after Alexander of Macedon. And similarly in India, all these Bharatas, like the brother of Rama, for example, or the choreographer behind Bharatnatyam, they have all been named ultimately after this first big Bharata. But who was he? Well, you see, there are different references to some Bharata in the Vishnu Purana and in the Adi Parva and so on. Not to make the story too long, I will not go into them here, except to say that they don't give the true message really. And the true message you find in the origin, namely in the 6th book of the Rig Veda, which is the oldest writing in India, probably in the world. And so this is by Bharadwaj, who, according to the Adi Parva of the Mahabharata, was the adoptive son of this Bharata. At any rate, he had known him personally. And so in one verse, he devotes only one verse to him, okay? That's the only authentic, testimony about him that we have. So he speaks of Bharata of old, which is more or less the equivalent of English, the late Bharata. So he had known Bharata personally, only by that time Bharata was already dead. And so he associates him with the fire worship. And indeed, his own name is an epithet of fire. So Bharata means to maintained, carried. And so that's something that is said of the fire. Originally, fire was maintained. You see, some brave fellow, ran to the tree where the lightning had struck and took a burning branch and then managed to keep this fire going by feeding the fire. And so this Bharata was a common epithet of Agni, fire. And so effectively it comes to mean fire. So that was his name. Now, already to name India after fire is perhaps not so nonsensical. The color of a part of the flag of India has fire color, or is the color of fire. The marigold, the haldi, turmeric, and so on. I mean, national symbols of India very often have that color. And but it's not because of the etymology of his name that he's famous. It's because of what he had done. And so what has he done? You see, it's not military or economic successes that he's famous for, or great architecture that he left behind. He did something far more impressive, with a far more lasting influence. He founded the Vedic tradition. And so his perhaps adoptive son, Bharadwaj, was the first Vedic rishi. So if you call your country Bharata, the territory of Bharata, what you are actually saying is Veda land. Now imagine that Narendra Modi had said, yes, you see, the president is going to preside, the president of Veda land is going to preside over this function. Now, there would have been a storm, about communal. And yet, you see, that is effectively what he said. Only he said it in a different term where people don't always understand the implications. But, Bharata is the founder of Veda land. His kingdom was not India, and later there are stories that he conquered all of India and so on. Nonsense. But nevertheless, the little kingdom that he ruled, which was perhaps as big as, shall I say, Belgium, that, first of all, his own country, thanks to some of his descendants, became quite a bit bigger, but it never comprised more than northwestern India. It's after that, after the, infighting around which the Mahabharata has been composed, after that, the expansion of his kingdom continued, not politically, but culturally. And so the Vedas gained an enormous prestige. All the kings in India had heard about it, and they wanted to be part of it. And so they invited reciters of the Vedas, people who, knew the tradition, knew how to pass this knowledge on and so on. They invited them, they gave them special privileges to make sure that they would remain. They gave them these agraharas, special settlements for them, to confer this prestige of the Vedic tradition onto their dynasty. And so, perfectly voluntarily, greater and greater parts of India, and ultimately the whole subcontinent, became Veda land. See, and so some people in India are not going to like that history. But, that's what it is. It's as communal as you can get.
So, among your books, is there any book that you feel is very underappreciated or misunderstood?
Oh, interesting. Well, first of all, there are books that have been completely ignored, like my book of only a few years ago about the Aryan invasion debate. I haven't heard any reaction on it at all. And of course, it is fairly technical. There aren't many people in India who can profitably read it. But because, you see, this field of Indo-European studies doesn't exist in India. And I've, for a short while, um, worked at an Indian university, Indus University Ahmedabad. And so I could normally not have been taken in there because there is a law that says that an Indian employer can only employ a foreigner if he can show that that foreigner brings a skill that nobody in India has. Now, in this case, it was not difficult at all because Indo-European studies, that doesn't exist in India. There's no university that teaches this. So there I was. But, you know, nevertheless, starting from a very amateurish position, I noticed that a number of Indians have greatly contributed to this, even spectacularly so in the case of Shrikant Talageri, who sought out all the historical information in the Vedas, and that's impressive. Then right now there is this Yajna Devam. I understand he's an Indian American who is right now lecturing here in India, right now in Bengaluru, about the decipherment of the Indus script, where he seems to have made a breakthrough, which happens to confirm that the language, the main language of Harappa, was Sanskrit, not Dravidian or anything else. Then right now also there is this Jijit Nadumuri Ravi from Bangalore who mapped the geography of the Vedas and the Ramayana and Mahabharata with some very surprising findings. So we are getting somewhere. And you see, many of these people are indeed outsiders, not perfect amateurs, but typically specialists of something else. Astronomers, bank clerks. Shrikant Talageri is famously, you see, all the enemies always call the bank clerk Talageri. But you see, he has these findings that all the specialists have not been capable of so far. And so he uses common sense, and he very much uses logic. You see, he's really surprising how he can tease out all the information that is really present in the data that we have, that everybody else also has, but does not manage to extract the relevant information from. You know, like he shows, you see how the Vedas describe emigration from India rather than immigration into India. How they describe a gradient from east to west. You see that the contact with Afghanistan comes at the end of the Vedas, not at the beginning, as the invasion theory presupposes, and so on. So, you know, in the beginning I despaired a bit of what Indians could contribute. Because indeed, you see, there were many hotheads, you know, who distorted the debate seriously, who brought in way too much Indian nationalism, again, that problem. But you see, gradually, some very happy surprises happened with Indians coming to the fore and contributing things that nobody had even thought of.
So, with that, we come to the end. Thank you so much for your time, sir, and we look forward to having you again on our channel. And before ending, can you also tell us when your book is coming out?
That depends on the publisher, but I suppose, you know, early this year.
Okay, so thank you so much, sir, for giving us your time. And with that, we conclude this session. We'll see you all again soon in our next episode. Thank you. Good night.
Namaste, everyone.